Thanks so much for introducing me, Kim, and thank you for having me here. I'm really excited. I've never seen this beautiful place, and I really love it here already, so I'm sure the surroundings are even more inspiring to the eye. Thanks for coming, everyone. My name is Sandra, and I love fungi just as Kim does. My sort of interest is a little bit different in the sense that my background is in studying the root symbiotic fungi, so the ones you don't really see until they emerge, probably around eucalypt trees and other trees, you know, depending on season and stuff. And I suppose this talk is not going to have lots of pretty photos of fungi because we're looking at their sort of underground, hidden side today. And I've heard someone mention the soil food web before. Yeah, so pretty much this is exactly what the presentation will be about. And it does stem from the background of Elaine Ingham's work, who has discovered this amazing process where all the interactions occur around the root of the plants and feed plants, and the interactions are between all these incredible creatures that I want to introduce to you today that many of us don't get to see because we don't have microscopes. But maybe afterwards you might decide I want a microscope and I want to look at these things. So we'll definitely focus a lot on the fungi side of things, but I think it's really essential that the whole ecosystem is explained, and also how you can cultivate that ecosystem in your own backyard. That's going to be the sort of finale. But I'll just go through a little bit of the introduction more definitively. So we'll define what soil is, because it's all about the soil. You know, without the soil, we have really no plants, we can't breathe. Really, it's all born in the soil, so to speak. So really, it's like understanding that as below, so above, the healthier your ecosystem, that's supporting all of the above ground animals and plants, is to do with how healthy that ecosystem underground is. And the soil food web concept, so we'll introduce that as well. And the different creatures that you can already I'm starting to show you already. And then you meet the team, so all the little players in this little soil ecosystem, or big really. And how that relates to our plant succession, to understand, like, why do I want to grow, strawberries, but I'm growing weeds? You know, understanding that, we know like why that happens, and that's to do with this microbiome, this soil food web concept. And then I want to introduce you at the end to the Giving Soil Initiative, and that's where you might want to be involved in this afterwards when you hear about what it is. So I won't spoil the secret yet, but basically it's all about cultivating your own soil plant root microbiome. How can you do that in your own backyard, and improve your own habitat in terms of what grows in your garden and what you want to select to grow, and also how you can maybe contribute that to farmers and help farmers grow better foods. Better, when I mean better foods as in, less intensive farming, and let nature take its course, and I'll describe that a little bit more as well. So what is soil? And it is plants and associated microbes utilizing sand, silt and clay. So like the traditional definition is just that it's sand, silt and clay, but without the life, these are just mineral particles that the plants can't even access. So really, and also there's a really big organic matter component that's largely missing now from our soils because of the way we've treated soils and everything that's happening, as you may know, in the world right now, in terms of how we treat nature and agriculture, and how much we're taking from it, or we're actually removing that organic matter, which we need very desperately for our microbes to feed on. And so it's all about it being solubilized and also cycled. So it's being available to the plants and cycled and recycled continuously. Because it's very much a system that allows itself to recover and generate. It's self-sustainable. Like, in the forest, no one fertilizes it. Everything just drops down and it gets recycled through the microbial systems, and it gets taken back to the plant, and no one ever fertilizes the forest. It's sort of, that's what we're trying to aim with understanding these processes. So as you can see here on your left, you have a root that comes down, and then you can see that there's actually life inside this tiny little particle, and there's microscopic things going on, but there's also bigger organisms as well, and there's fungal hyphae, which I'll introduce later to you, but they basically fungal cells, and you might have heard the word by now, mycelium, which is like, you can actually see the threads of fungi in soil or on wood, decaying wood. And of course there's the microscopic world as well of that. So it's very much a complex ecosystem right there under the root or around the root. And it's estimated that there are several thousand different taxa, so different types of organisms within just 1 gram of soil, and 1 billion bacterial cells, and also 200 meters of fungal hyphae, so these thread-like cells of fungi, because that's how fungi grow. So it is a living thing, and there's so much life, and we hardly know what kind of life occurs in the soil. We have hardly studied any of it, and we can only culture like 0.1% where we can actually like cultivate it and see it, because it's so interdependent that you can't just isolate things, put them in a bottle or in a lab and say, well, we understand this now. We don't. Everything's so complex and only interacts and genes switch on only when other things are present. It's a very, very complex system, and it's so diverse. It's the most biodiverse ecosystem in the world, the soil, if it's allowed to be, because everything's micro, so you've got like this universe within like a meter, of all the things happening, and you can see all the different creatures, and we talk about a lot of these organisms, so I won't, go into them now because we'll go into them in detail. But the soil food web concept is based on, which Elaine's work has really, pioneered 40 or so years ago, is that it's just like, how there's food chains, so food webs in the ecosystem above, it's exactly the same thing. So you need some food source. So in this case, we've got the sun producing energy, taking that energy through photosynthesis into like sugar. Basically sugar, we're run on sugar, whether we like carbs or not. Really, carbohydrates is what runs the world because it comes from the sun, and then it feeds those initial organisms. So it feeds the plant then extracts that and passes it onto the fungal hyphae, just that mycelium that I've added on kind of onto the side, because that then pumps all those sugars, those carbohydrates, or liquid carbon we could call it, and shares it with the other organisms. And of course, as the plant dies, you've got organic matter created on top as well, and that's also part of the food chain or the food source for these organisms. So the first things that happen is like the bottom of the food chain are the bacteria and the fungi. And they also, what they do also is they combine what comes from the plant with what's in the soil itself, in the mineral component. They're the only organisms that can extract the mineral particles like the zinc, all the nutrients we need. That's what fungi and bacteria specifically get from the rock material, from the sand, silt and clay. And that's how soil is created. They break it down, they have powerful enzymes, and they break those minerals, break the rock to mineral format, and then pass that onto the plant and then feed the plant. So then as the plant dies, it returns it back. You see, there's no really mining happening, it's all just cycling continuously. And then of course we need something to eat the bacteria and fungi to release their nutrients, because the bacteria and the fungi are the richest now, that like they've got all the food inside of them as well, not just the plant. And so the protozoa, which are unicellular animals, just one cell, and I'll introduce you to those, and more like multicellular organisms like tiny little worms called nematodes. Actually, majority of the biomass of animals on Earth is actually nematodes. It's insane that these tiny microscopic worms is what makes up the world's biomass in terms of animals. It's like the largest part of it, the largest proportion of nematodes. So nematodes eat different things. Some feed on roots, some on bacteria, some on fungi. And of course then we've got and it all like, once the bacteria are eaten, the nematode eats the bacteria, it has to do something with the excess nutrients. So it poos it out. And the poo of the nematode becomes the food for the plant. And same with the protozoa, they eat 10,000 bacteria, a day for a tiny little unicellular organism. So all that excess nutrients that the bacteria had that the protozoa can't handle, it just releases it in its own poo, and then that basically is what fertilizes our plants. So, and then we've got the higher organisms, like things that we can now see with our naked eye, like arthropods, little insects and all kinds of things, and of course it continues, and then they get eaten by the birds, and it just keeps going. And every ecosystem's the same. You're just replacing the maybe the top predators, so to speak. But everything just churns in this way, and that poo is also always taken back to the plant. And this is why Elaine and a colleague developed this concept of the poop loop. It's exactly the same thing, but it's just all about the poo. From the sunlight, you get the plant, you get dead organic matter that decomposes. Churn that down, and then whatever eats the predators of those decomposers, the bacteria and the fungi, the predators eat them, poop it out, and then cycle it back to the plant, and then more predators, and you can just see more nitrogen is released and other nutrients, and then the plant sucks it up again. And usually it's through those fungal networks underground. It's like the forest or the plant is eating itself, because you have the decomposers that decompose its body parts. But then the symbiotic fungi on the bottom of the roots, on the roots, take those nutrients back up again. So it's completely sort of self-eating in a way when you look at it that way, self-perpetuating, self-feeding. And of course the sun feeds it, so you keep growing, but you keep cycling yourself through that process. Getting a bit hot.
Excuse me.
Yes.
From that previous slide,
yes.
Are nematodes predated on by the protozoa and the flagellates? Is that what that is saying?
It's the other way around. So predators are just eating the microscopic protozoa and stuff, but nematodes nematodes are like still like the second level of the food chain, but protozoa are smaller. So protozoa are eaten by nematodes as well. So nematodes can eat protozoa because they're bigger, much bigger. So they'll be eating bacteria and protozoa.
So what eats nematodes?
Probably there's other nematodes that eat nematodes, bigger nematodes, and also earthworms.
Yeah, because the understanding normally is nematodes are bad for your garden.
That's only the root feeding nematodes.
Like tomatoes, don't you?
Yes.
In the same place.
The root, not nematodes. And this is partly why it's so important to have the predatory nematodes, and this is why.
Balance.
Yes, because also nematodes and all other creatures that eat plants signals like alcohol compounds, so they're not healthy to start with because the rest of the soil food web is missing. So they're stressed, and then there's potential for something has to eat them, you see, to get them back, so that we get more biodiversity, more nutrients. So those plants are almost saying, look, I'm sick, I need to be eaten, and then animals come, and that's what happens. That's now been studied, and we know that that's how it works, that plants only get eaten, literally, like a swarm of grasshoppers will come through, and they can see, and they can smell, and they can taste what's coming off of those plants, and they'll only land on the unhealthy crops. They'll never touch a healthy crop. There's no signal in the plant saying, please eat me. So it's very, very, very communicative. Everything, and this is why if we understand it, we don't need to use pesticides and chemicals and fertilizers. We just don't, because that's what nature does already,
That applies to all bugs.
Yes. So of course caterpillars still need to eat, right? But you can have a caterpillar, often caterpillar will actually won't even love, it will only go for the leaves. It's what's so specific, like there's literally chemical communication happening, and pheromones and all kinds of stuff. Pheromones are more like attractants, but they are attractants, and they're attracting mates. So once again, there's that interplay as well, where you have even like how mating occurs is determined by what plants are available for there to be eggs, it's insane. And then the caterpillar, might decimate the tree, depending on the health of the tree, or it might just, once again, you need more plants. It will only go because there's one food source, and it's only one tree you've got in your backyard, and there's no other tree of that type very close by. Do you see what I'm getting at? It's like this whole chain reaction, like lack of biodiversity, the plants not being healthy because they don't have all their mates to work and feed them. So it's just like one thing goes like a domino effect, and then you get a disaster, like a whole monocrop.
Good bugs and bad bugs.
Yeah, and I don't see that, because of that, because I feel like, well, how can they be bad when they're just doing their job that the plant is telling them to do?
From our thinking.
Yes, exactly. And same with these microbes. We think, like Elaine does call them the bad guys, but the bad guys that say the root-feeding nematode or, another, like a pathogen, a fungal pathogen or something like that, they're only bad because the conditions created cause them to do their job, which is to decompose what's already unhealthy. And it's the same, I must say, with us. How when you're stressed, you're more likely to get sick. You don't, like, you can go and spend probably time with people that have COVID at the moment and not even get it, because your body's like, well, I'm not stressed, like, you know, why would I? It's kind of like, if you look at it that way, it's kind of more compassion for the fact that what is actually happening, you know, we have more understanding and therefore more resilience that we can build, you know, if we start looking at the entire system and where things are falling. And yes, so this is where I'm really so passionate about this, in a way, for like a future that where we don't have to have all the chemicals that keep weakening the system, you know, and keep weakening our immune systems, because the microbes that are killed, like glyphosate also kills, it's actually a microbe killer. And so what it does is it kills the plants and the microbes. But then when we consume that on our plants, what will it do to our gut? And we're mostly 90% you know, microscopic cells. We're not our human cells. 90% of our body is microbial. So like, you can just bring it back to your own life, like how essential this stuff is, and we don't really connect it, you know. But if we start eating based on this model being present, or the ecosystem supporting us, we're supporting ourselves even, like, directly, because the microbes we're ingesting are different, you know. And it's just amazing. And it turns out we're like fungi. We've got a lot of fungal biomass in us that that's just beginning to be discovered. So we are just a bunch of fungi. And I do talk about fungi a lot because, I mean, that's my background and I love fungi, but I think this is so good how you can combine the fungi together with all this, you know. I've got so much to get through. I'm going to keep you here till 12. So, yes, so we've got nutrients. This is I'm giving you like what the plant gets from these organisms. So there's nutrient cycling, there's minerals coming in, there's carbon through these hyphae, or the cells of fungi on the roots. They sequester a lot of carbon because they demand that sun-based sugar from the plant. And so that comes down. And then you've got glomalins. So they make these glues. The bacteria and the fungi make glues, and they kind of keep things together and allow pore space for water and, you know, oxygen to infiltrate. And as they do that, they also sequester this carbon into these glues, and it stays in the ground, building humus. So soil organic matter and humus is being built, and that provides soil structure because of all the, you know, things being sticky. And water absorption and oxygen as well, and delivery of water comes into it. What have I missed? So then we've got drought resistance because of that. And then you've got immunity on the plant because there's space taken up by these beneficial organisms. So you have through competition, you know, there's no disease can come in, that's one way. But also inhibition, because they produce antibiotics of their own against things to protect their plant. They protect, like, you know, naturally they're like in love with the plant. The plant feeds them, so they're protecting it inadvertently. And also because they're predating on all the other things, like, you know, the root nematode will be eaten by the predatory nematode. And they literally prefer to eat, it's been shown that they prefer to eat the one that eats the plant. So it's like a protective mechanism.
Tasty.
They're tastier, yeah. And it's true because they're full of the plant sugar. Makes sense, right? Yeah, they taste better to the predatory nematode because it's getting more nutrients from it because it's sucked it directly from the plant.
So you're saying that glue that those fungi produce,
yes, the
creates highways for the roots to the...
Probably as well, yeah.
And the
I haven't
soil
even
for the roots to move through?
Yeah, I haven't thought of it that way, but yeah, well, it's like a substance produced probably for the fungi to be like protected as well. It's like a glycoprotein. I'll talk about it a little bit later. But as it produces it, it's like an excrement from the fungi making carbon. Like that sweetness kind of stays around it, but because it's so hard to break down, it's like a hardy structure. It stays around. But yes, probably it probably lubricates things. You know, I haven't even thought of it that way, but yeah, there's probably many other functions it has. Because why would the fungi produce it and keep it there long term? You know. But basically, if you look at it from that perspective of the microbe, and specifically the fungal cell, let's say, and the plant, that interchange, there's literally cell-to-cell exchange of nutrients. So, you know, exudate just means sugar and amino acids and things that get expelled from the plant and feeds these microbial cells, and then the microbes, as I said earlier, feed minerals back to the plant and vitamins from the bacteria. It's not just minerals, there's so many things that actually get passed on, you know, to make the plant healthy and full of nutrients for us. And of course, all of this, to be able to actually see it, we use the microscope for that, to have a look at down the microscope. And I now want to introduce you to the different team players of this microbiome, that the soil food web where everything interacts and is necessary, and we can then know if it's the presence and the numbers through the microscopy work to understand what, like, is your plant going to get what it needs? Does it have enough of these organisms? Can we give it more of that? You know, sort of to spur it along through cultivation of our own compost or worm farm or whatever we're going to choose, and I'll talk about that at the end. But these are basically the organisms, and mostly at the top you've got protozoa, a flagellate with a tail, tiny little things that zoom around, beautiful shelled one cell amoebae. So they're amoebae, so you know, amoeba is like a sort of one of those things that just oozes out its tentacles, so to speak, but not really. Like they're very, very cool. There's ones that are in shells and there's ones that are naked. The naked ones are more exciting to me because you can see them moving, and I've got a few videos of them. And a fungal hypha. So under the microscope we'll see the fungi, and for me the most interesting is finding out the biomass between the bacteria and fungi, because that drives what plants will be sustained, and I'll talk about that in length. And then a nematode, that's a predatory nematode right there in the corner. It's got a tooth, so we can consume those root-feeding nematodes. So let's just quickly go through what bacteria do. This is an abstract image, like it's been obviously not a real microscopic image, but it's been, you know, made prettier. So you've got mineral rock, and that's what they do. They can extract minerals from rock. And they transform mineral and organic compounds into other things, so the plant, they can become available to the plant. So they fix nitrogen, some of the bacteria, into ammonia. That's atmospheric nitrogen. The hardest, the most energy-intensive process is to make nitrogen from, you know, for plants like ammonium or nitrate. And that's a very expensive process and it requires a lot of fossil fuel to do that. But these guys have done it, they do it themselves without energy, whereas we spend a lot of money on creating nitrogen for plants. So nitrifying ammonium to nitrate, and also this is just grain of sand covered in microorganisms or microaggregates, basically forming microaggregates, pulling with glues, sticking things together, so lots of bacterial action there. But because the bacteria require more nitrogen than carbon, because that's what their bodies are mainly made out of, if you have a lot of bacteria in the soil and you till it, all your carbon will go up into the atmosphere. And you can see through global imagery from NASA that whenever there's tillage happening on farms, which normally happens like, you know, at a specific time of the year, the entire atmosphere has got so much carbon in it, and you can see it, and it all goes red in the imagery. And then as plants start growing, you can see it all being sucked out of the atmosphere. So it just shows, I wish I had the link to that, I could have shown you. But it's literally, you can watch a time lapse of all these, you know, map of the world throughout a year. And it goes from red when tillage happens to blue or green when it's all sucked out of the atmosphere. It's color coded because of, you know, obviously heat sensors for the carbon in the atmosphere, and really interesting. Like that just shows we can just literally like regreen the planet, and this carbon thing that we're so obsessed with is not a thing anymore, you know. So they're most nutrient-rich organisms. That's why everything else eats them and has to, because they're so rich in nutrients that the other organisms don't need as much. So that's why they release all that. And they feed protozoa, nematodes, and earthworms, and then for plants. And the next superhero, call them all superheroes, is the mycorrhizal microbiome. So what mycorrhizal means is micro is fungi and rhizal is root. And so basically they just root symbiotic fungi. And You can see that in this image, if you didn't have the fungi growing on the root, it would be a very poor ecosystem. You don't have much else going on in there on that side. Whereas on this side, when the fungal hyphal extensions, when the cells of the fungi extend from the root, you've got this incredible richness of biodiversity happening around that root. And in fact, it all happens very close to the root. And you've got this thing called the rhizosheath, and all it is like a sheath, like a clothing on top of the root, and that's to do with all the bacterial glues and the glomalin, which is that glycoprotein coming from the fungal cells, sticking that mineral component, but within that, around it is all the bacteria and the fungi and all the other organisms are sitting closely, patrolling and feeding off the root. And then you can see that on the closer level, and you can see the glues, but also the fungal hyphae going through the, holding it all together, which is nice because that prevents erosion as well, of course. And then we've got avascular mycorrhizal fungi, that's what they look like, and I'll talk about them as to why they're called this. But basically, they are symbiotic root extensions of up to 90% of plants. So most plants on Earth have these symbiotically on their roots, and they're more absorptive by 100 times than roots themselves. And you can, of course, if the root is that big, you can only access so much, but when you're microscopic, you can then go further and further and further and suck things out much easier, and you can penetrate into areas roots can't. And about 10 to 20% faster plant growth is a result of these guys doing their job, because they keep demanding more carbon, so the plant freely takes the sugar, the sun energy, and so therefore it grows better as a result. And the reason why they're called avascular mycorrhizal fungi is because between the cytoplasm and the cortex, within the cortex of the cell, so not really inside the cell, but in between, so it still penetrates the cell, but you're not puncturing anything. There's this symbiotic communication where the fungal hyphae can go in and then produce this amazing little thing called little tree, which is avascule miniature tree. It's just phenomenal that this is inside a plant cell growing inside symbiotically. And of course, that's where the feeding stations are. That's where all the nutrient exchange is happening straight from the plant cell into the avascule, back out into the world from the root, into the soil world. And you can see, what did I write there? Oh, this is an interesting fact. So mycelium of 4 meters square of perennial grasslands can stretch around the equator. So these little threads, if you put them back to back like a chain network, it will still stretch around. Can you imagine? That's the amount of diversity and just volume, sheer volume. Imagine the weight of it all, because it's all moisture containing, carbon, it's full of minerals, it's good stuff. Yeah. Fungi are amazing. And so you can see when you can label these avascular to detect them in your plant root. You can label them with specific probes and look at under the microscope, and they fluoresce when they pick up the probe. So you can see the little avascules in the cell. And this is glomalin. And this was discovered by Sarah Wright I think she worked for the agriculture department in the USDA. And in only 95 or so, I think it was 1995, when she discovered this amazing glycoprotein, and because it's so carbon rich and it's stable, so we don't know how many years, but potentially hundreds of years, it doesn't decompose, and that's your carbon sink, and that's what creates humus. Partly that's the contribution of these guys. So that's just showing the glomalin around soil particles. And you can see the carbon if you label it with radioactive compounds, because that's how you study travel of different substances within biological materials. You can label it, so they gave it radioactive carbon to go through the hyphae, and you can see it, that it's there. It's just a photo to show you that it is full of carbon. And of course, that's the effects, having better plant growth if you inoculate with fungi, and better root systems and more yields in potatoes. And so that's pretty much it for the mycorrhizal part. There's also, of course, a whole thing I could talk about is trees have different types of mycorrhizal fungi. That's what I kind of studied in my PhD, and they were heavy metal tolerant, but I won't go into this now because I want to really concentrate on this. How do we Yeah, you're gonna have a
I was
question?
just at the previous slide, you said treated and untreated, so those plants are treated.
With the mycorrhizal fungi.
Okay.
So as in like they're inoculated, I should say.
Right. And is that the same sort of inoculant that you buy when you buy a green manure crop that comes with an inoculant?
Yes, they sometimes probably won't have mycorrhizal fungi, I don't think, but they will have a rhizobium
Yes.
inoculated onto them, which is, you know, the fungi, the bacteria that fix nitrogen. So yeah, if you can actually put, and I'll talk about that a little later, but you can put on seed, you know.
And because some of those inoculants are seed specific, aren't they? Plant specific.
Absolutely. Rhizobium will only go with, you know, pulses and legumes and
Legumes.
yeah, so definitely. And different crops have different mycorrhizal fungi that they need. There's a few species that are like universal and they go with every plant, but with like the forest type of fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, they need like very specific sometimes, you know. It's all very, very amazing and we don't really know anything about it. Like we know so little. We've just honed in on the agricultural ones. We've got a few species, but there's so much to learn. Like,
So are farmers embracing this? Are they putting inoculant in?
can I tell you something? I've tested every one of these sorry, when I say every one of them, someone has tested. I've tested every time someone tells me they bought a mycorrhizal inoculum. I ask for a tiny bit and I put it under the microscope. In Australia, there's no fungi in it. It's you're paying for play, $100 a pop sometimes for a small jar or a bag. So the problem with that is that you can't. I personally believe you can't bottle nature. There's different ways of accessing that where it's still all these fungi are surviving and they're native. And I know our crops are not native, but at the same time, there's all this play around with, you know, it's introduction of things, you know. And a lot of the crops sort of originally obviously come from these fungi, so they have to be already in our environment. And then there's some people studying like how are they competing with our native, because our rainforests have a vascular mycorrhizal fungi as well. So how is that displacing? Like, you know, there's all this stuff going on. But as far as I know, I don't know anyone in Australia that's producing. There's a PhD student that did research on all of the products. He tested 100 and only one of them had some indication of spores of the vascular mycorrhizal fungi being present.
Yeah, but when I buy a legume crop, it comes with an inoculant and it does produce the little nodules of nitrogen.
But that's different because that's bacteria. So we know that's been studied for like 100 years or something.
It's a different
Yeah.
sphere, is it?
It's bacteria, and we're talking about this is like just fungi at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is just this avascular mycorrhizal fungi strain that I'm talking about. And yes, there are products you can buy, and I would recommend not to. We need to actually understand that they're there, or have someone test them before they get sold. That the survival is there when you sell it and the farmer applies it to their land. There's other ways of extracting that from nature, much better way, and you can probably teach the men to fish, and that's much better way for them to feed themselves, so to speak. So this is kind of what we're getting at in the end as well here. Maybe not so much with the mycorrhizal fungi themselves, but with just all the other players. And because fungal spores are present on the strips where it's not getting sprayed, and you know what I mean, farmers it can easily spread through their farm if they follow certain protocols and not destroy these networks that are in their landscape. So the next group of fungi are the ones you were talking about earlier. They won't show their pretty faces in here because we're looking at the microscopy, but they're the ones that are saprophytes. So it just means they're breaking down organic matter, and you can call them decomposers. You know, and that's what you normally see, like the stinkhorns you were talking about earlier, and majority of the fungi everything that you see growing on wood and not in the soil will be these decomposer kind of fungi. And we want as much as possible in our soil of these guys, especially if you want to grow a forest. So you can see what they are. This is just a cell, a fungal cell, and you can see how dark it is, and the darker the better really, and the thicker the better, and that's how the calculations I use incorporate their thickness, their length, and their color to know, to get the biomass, you know, in the gram of soil, how much biomass do we have of fungi in that particular soil or compost. And what they do is they love eating organic matter, so they decompose woody stuff, because they've got so many different enzymes. They sort of like that's their thing, you know. Everything else, sort of like termites, they need the fungi to do that before they can eat. We say termites eat wood, they don't. Same with earthworms or worms, like composting worms. They don't actually eat the food we give them, they eat the bacteria and the fungi. It's all about eating that lower food chain, most nutrient-rich organisms. And because they like woody stuff, obviously, like if you have just like weeds growing, they don't have much wood, so you won't have much fungi. But if you go to a forest, you know, it kind of keeps increasing, and I'll talk about succession, but so that's why they develop later when things are matured, you know, when the ecosystem has bloomed, that's where a lot of fungal biomass will be present. So, yeah, and because they have this growth where they just keep spreading forward and feeding from the outside, but because they like long and, you know, spready, they bind, they go around things, they extract nutrients from around particles, and so therefore they engulf soil particles, and then that means that they're holding things, you know, together, and so that means it can't just run off with the rain and be washed off, you know. It means there's space now for organisms, other organisms like nematodes to live in, and worms, and they're making these spaces, and oxygen is available, and everything really is about oxygen as well. If you have anaerobic conditions, fungi can't survive, you've got bacteria, carbon blows off into the atmosphere constantly. So you always need them to create, they're like sort of the creators of the, you know, the designers of that first ecosystem within which your plant will grow. So they really provide soil structure, and they feed, of course, as a result of being there, nematodes and arthropods, earthworms, you know, all the little tiny mites and things that are springtails and stuff. I'll show you a few pics of those later as well. And they release plant available nutrient in the form of ammonium. And that's a really good thing, because ammonium is really what drives plant succession. So weeds like nitrate, bacteria produces nitrate, higher like trees like ammonium. So there has to be more fungi for the tree to be supported, and the tree thrives on ammonium. It's a very nice, neatly done science, once again by Elaine, showing, I think Elaine might have shown that as well, or maybe she has learned that later, but it's one of those things that, you know, if we understand those things, like why is the weeds growing in my soil, what's going on, we can tell just by looking that the only reason that is happening is because the ammonium is missing. Why is the ammonium missing? Fungi are not present in the amount required for that plant. And because they sequester this carbon into their cells to protect themselves, really. The fulvic and humic acids, the protection barrier is what the carbon is, because it's so hard to decompose. And it's also chitin, you know, like how insects are so hardy, like you can pin them and they'll be there for hundreds of years. It's because they've got chitin. This is this complex carbon structure as well. And so fungi are full of these compounds, and they're very hard to decompose as a result, and therefore they layer down this carbon in the soil for, you know, hundreds of years potentially. So, and that's the result, sequestration of carbon into soil from the atmosphere. So that's just to show you, basically that's a 400 times magnification under the microscope, and that's just the same thing I've just mentioned. So they require organic matter, they sequester carbon. I basically just copied that just to make it more pretty. Release plant available nutrients when eaten by arthropods. And you can see that's a little testata amoeba. I'm just going to start showing you little like snippets of what it all is. Little bacteria. There's another little hypha over there, different color. You can see the colors are different, and you have to sort of like, there's like a color coding for this process, and that's a thicker hypha as well. But they select against weeds because they produce this ammonium. And this is an image showing you how they how would you say, they hug a piece of like an aggregate, the envelope. They're enveloping it to get nutrients from it, but at the same time as they squeeze it towards them, you know, growing, like you could just imagine it kind of going, and there's beautiful space, and soil can now be enriched with oxygen, which is good. And this is a network of hyphae holding soil particles, and then bacterial glues, you know, so the bacteria can stick, because these organisms want to be stuck to the substrate or the food they're eating, because then they got to, you know, put their enzymes on that and extract the mineral component and give it to their plant. So they're very much creating these beautiful structures. So let's go on to this now that we've covered bacteria and fungi. We need to have a good ratio of those depending on what you're growing, right? So if you just want to grow, like at the beginning, you know, when the earth first began, there would have been no organic matter. There would have just been all these gases and rock and nothing else, right? So something to start life, bacteria were like the first to get those minerals from that rock. And then as they died, they would have been their first organic matter, like, you know, the first carbon. And then eventually lichens would grow. You know, it's actually a fungal symbiosis between bacteria and fungi getting together and cyanobacteria and photosynthesizing. But that's what would have happened. You know, on rocks you often see these lichens, right? Like the orange ones, and like they're decomposing that rock together. They're like getting those minerals out. So that's what happens at the beginning. So you literally at the beginning just have bacteria. And then, you know, as it goes up in succession, that changes, that ratio of bacteria to fungi changes. And it keeps going until fungi are way more dominant in the forest ecosystem compared to bacteria. So you really want that dominance, and that's what these plants need in order to be fed. That's all it is really, you know. So if you have a weedy pioneer species growing, it's because that's what the soil is providing. That's the ratio of fungi to bacteria. That's all it can feed it, and so therefore these weeds grow. So they're not really weeds, they're just pioneer species that are recovering, and as they die, they're feeding the ecosystem, and that can grow in succession. It's just things replace each other over time. And this is just another way of showing that. This is another very good person if you're more interested in this work, David Johnson. And I'll talk about a bioreactor he created because he works with farmers just as Elaine does. And basically he just converted this to show it in a different way. But if you look at it, if you want to grow vegetables, for example, in your garden, then you want that fungal to bacterial ratio to be almost 1. If you have that and you can give it to someone who's got a microscope who can test that, you know you'll be growing your vegetables. But anything below that, you will be growing weeds and there'll be more nitrate and there'll be lack of oxygen because once again, there's no space because the bacteria are gluing everything together. It becomes really, you know, hard for anything else to live there other than bacteria. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And then, you know, you keep going in succession below ground between the bacterial and fungal biomass ratio, and therefore you develop your succession of plants and you can get an old growth forest. And these are the numbers to show that biomass of fungi that needs to be present when you analyze it. So that's pretty much covered that part. And the next component or the next little superhero is our protozoa. And they're my favorite in the sense because like fungi are just there, they're great and I love watching them, but they're not moving, they're just sitting there, whereas this organism moves. And there's different types. The flagellates I'll show you in a minute, but these are the amoebae. So just an animal that's made out of one cell, and they're called collectively protozoa. Proto just means first, zoa means animal, so like your first animals. So they eat bacteria and other protozoa, and as a result release plant nutrients, available nutrients. And one of these little guys can eat 10,000 bacteria per day. That's a lot. Because, and you can see it all, it's all in its body, bacteria inside of it. Besides, it's also, you know, organs. And they feed macro and microarthropods because they themselves get consumed. And there's different types. So like some of them eat each other. So like, you know, they engulf in other protozoa, smaller protozoa. Some of them are symbiotic, and a lot of them like will live in plants like as parasites. So like some of the diseases we have like Phytophthora and stuff are also belong to that group. And they can be in that symbiosis either by eating other things or living together within them or parasitizing them. Yeah, really cool. And then you've got phototrophy. So some of them are like, what are those things called in lakes? They look like this. They're sort of like little calcium rich, I forget what it's called. Anyway, so they photosynthesize. So they they're protozoa, but they can produce their own food from sunlight. And then there's saprotrophs. So they're the ones that can decompose organic matter, so they'll eat dead bodies of other things. So they have plethora of functions in the soil. And some of them are so exquisite because they make, out of the minerals that are around them, they make a little shell around themselves. So they're literally stuck inside, but they're protected by this beautiful shell, and they're quite elaborate, these shells. And so when you see that under the microscope, it's quite like, wow, this tiny little thing can just like pick up minerals and ornament itself in this. And the fossil record shows what happens in the environment because those shells survive through aeons of time, and they can tell what was happening in the environment by studying, you know, the record of protozoa. Like, there's insane potential for science. There's forensic scientists are using protozoa to see what happened, how long the body has been dead, because of the succession of protozoa that's present under that body. Like, it's quite crazy. But in the soil, what they do is, this is like a shelled one I took a photo of. So they consume bacteria and then they poop out, and you can see actually some debris coming out of this one. So it's excreting whatever bacteria it churned, and that would be like your fertilizer for your plant right there. And that's just to show you once again little bacteria. They're about 1 micrometer thick. And that's another type of protozoa. You can kind of tell because of the way they look, and you count them. You count them, and then, you know, statistically tells you how many there are present and how that once again relates to the plant that you want to grow. And that's another one. These actually no one really knew until quite recently what they were, but they're a type of protozoa called Arcella. And this is another type of protozoa. It doesn't have like a shell, but you can see it like moving inside. It's cool. It's like a moon kind of, but a tiny little thing. And yeah, they're called Cercozoa. So it's all these names to describe how they look. Flagellates are amazing. They're tiny, but they zoom around. They've got these whipping flagella, and they propel themselves through the ecosystem, and they consume bacteria as well. So they're very much, very active, very mobile, just zooming around under the microscope. And these guys, are, like, when you have them in the soil, it's not the best thing to have. Like, you don't want a lot of these, but they are probably the most fascinating organisms because they're like little animals, literally, and they're so small. Like, you're looking at 400 times magnification, and they're called ciliates. And often in stagnant water, that's what you'll find most of. So the water stinks and it's gross, but when you look under the microscope, it's teeming with life and incredible. But because they love reduced oxygen conditions, they're an indicator for us that if you have them, and they are consuming your bacteria, so there's nutrient cycling, but that means there's also lower oxygen, and that's a problem because all of the diseases feed, and even like root-feeding nematodes, they love reduced oxygen conditions. So we can play around by increasing the fungal biomass specifically. We can increase the oxygen level in your soil, and therefore, you know, just grow good plants. Have your roots healthy and your plant healthy. And the next group is the nematodes, and that's our last sort of group, so to speak. And they obviously multicellular organisms. So now we're looking at worms, pretty much. They're still microscopic, but they have all different mouth parts. And that's how you tell what you have. When they've got this spear here, and with a little bulb at the bottom, you know you've got a root nematode problem because they're eating, they're piercing your plant, they're damaging your plant. But these guys, these omnivore guys, they're much bigger and they will eat these guys. Predators have a little tooth. Sorry, I should have said predator. But omnivores will probably also suck in a smaller nematode as well when they're really big. And when I mean big, you still need a microscope. You still need the 400 times magnification. And so we identify them based on their mouth parts. And that's a fungal feeder. So what you can do is find out how many fungal feeding nematodes you have, and then you know whether you have a good fungal biomass. You can also do it the other way around, where you extract all your nematodes and then go, okay, these are the ratios of nematodes of this type in my soil. What do I need to have more of? Because there's too many, let's say, root-feeding nematodes, so you know you need more of these guys. So you can help farmers create the ecosystem based on the knowledge that you gain from the microscopic work, finding out what your biology is telling you. So that's just a photo of a nematode. I think this is a fungal feeding nematode on the mouth part. So this is like that's what I was saying earlier. Remember when I said like that the biomass of animals is mostly nematodes, like that's the largest. So 80% of all animals on Earth are actually nematodes. That's hard to imagine, but that's because we don't see them, you know, with our naked eye. So, and they consume bacteria, fungi, nematodes, other nematodes, and poop out plant available nutrients. And of course, they are the food for all these organisms, like nematode trapping fungi. There are fungi that literally grow around the nematode and suck the contents out of nematodes. That's like sci-fi crazy stuff. It's like that one of those amoebas doing crazy things. But yeah, so that's a little predatory nematode, and they would consume all kinds of, because they're bigger, they will just consume what they can. But because they're a predator, they can also consume, you know, other nematodes.
Can they be out of balance? Can you have too many of them?
Probably not, because everything's driven depending on food,
Yeah,
so they'll
it's
just
not there.
naturally, yeah. That's the thing, like top predators are not the problem, because they'll just can't have any more food, so they just can't breed.
Yeah.
Whereas everything else can be very much out of balance, you know. And that's why, like, introducing, for example, like we know now that if we had dingoes back in our ecosystem, because they're like the key predator, that would be very different for all the, you know, cat invasions we have and all the other things. And balance would change again. So we know that because studies are showing that consistently that way. Do you remember the Yellowstone National Park? What happened? There was elk was eating out all the tree saplings that were growing, so no forest was regrowing. So they put the wolf back in the system, and trees started to grow. So it's very, very similar, isn't it? The same. It's exactly the same.
You can Google that, and like Yellowstone reintroduce wolves, and it will go through the whole process. It's fascinating.
It's exactly the same with dingoes. It's happening in Australia. Like if they're allowed to introduce dingoes in certain areas, but there's, you know, that farming sheep and all that stuff that conflicts with it all. But that's what we need. We need, what are they called? Keystone species, I suppose. Yeah. And there's another name for those predators that are just like at the top. So yes, so they consume pretty much everything, these guys. Yeah, and we need them, and it's great when you find them in your compost or in your soil. That's like amazing. This is like my favorite photo, because that's when I caught a nematode pooing. I think I even got it on camera. I couldn't believe that I was watching and trying to identify it, and I'm like, oh my god, it just did a poo right in front of me. That is just so adorable. It was very cool. And so you can see how the bacteria now, you know, crushed. And that's what plants want, because all of that mineral content that's coming out of the bacteria is that's what the plant is able to consume. It can't consume, what is it, how much of the fertilizer? I think it's like 40% at least of the fertilizer we apply, nitrogen fertilizer, just goes off the land. Plants can't handle it, they can't even absorb it. It's just so expensive to make, so expensive to apply, and then ends up in the waterways and kills, you know, so much life as a result because of eutrophication. So this is our favorite little organism that we've been talking about for a lot. It's got a spear. It's gonna pierce your plant, and it's got this little bulb to puncture to drive its spear through the plant.
So that's a microscopic view just of the. Have you put some sort of radiation type?
I don't think so. I don't know what that is. I think I didn't have that photo. What does it say? Does it tell us what it is? It's probably maybe like
shells.
it's actually DIC, I think, differential interface, because you get to see all of that in that. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's a differential interface microscope image. It's just a microscopy technique where you can kind of like, it refracts the organs as well, because it's a bit different, isn't it? Good noticing. Yeah, like this one is a see-through light microscope image that I'm using just.
Yeah. So if we had a microscope, that's what
you would see. Yeah, all of these images I've been showing, unless they've got a reference to someone else's. Yeah, that's what you would see. And that's a good one because we can see the spear really well there. And of course, you know, these are the like top predators you can see in the soil. I call them the like soil intestines, because they just walk around and they poo all of those things that they just gathered. And also like a lot of the stuff survives, so like some of the bacteria will be still intact, so then spreading fungal spores, which they can't digest. So as they move, they're taking a fungal spore to another place. They're just a lovely little creature that does so much. They're just beautiful things. And yes, they cultivate and disseminate the microbes because in their gut they're just like eating it all and then spitting it out on the other end. And you know, as a result, when you have them, they increase soil nutrition very much, 7 times for nitrogen and 11 times by phosphorus. And of course, these little creatures called mites that no one really knows much about, once again, very unknown in Australia. We don't know much about the soil mites. It's like a whole, you could just study that for the rest of your life. You know, there's very little people studying them, and they're amazing. And of course, they're feeding on things. They're feeding on fungi. They're feeding on. We don't even understand what their really roles are. You know, and same with these guys. Have you ever heard of springtails? I think there's only 1 or 2 people in Australia studying springtails. Like, it's crazy. There's not, and they're so ancient. They're like an ancient form of insect that insects have then evolved from, and they're disappearing. And some of them can live like in the most extreme environments. And yeah, there's just beautiful things. They very much love eating fungi. Like I've seen my first springtail that I've seen would have been at the Caboolture BioBlitz maybe a couple of years ago, and it was like one of these ones, and it was in a rotting log of like fungi were, you know, decomposing that log because they love eating fungi. Yeah. So once again, going back to that succession, but then looking at it from a perspective of the organisms that we just went through, and also the nitrogen, how it balances out and goes from ammonium bacterial dominated to, nitrate to ammonium because of fungal presence. You've got like protozoa to start with because they're consuming your bacteria at the beginning, and then, you know, bacterial feeding nematodes will come later in succession. So once again, you can determine at what maturity level your ecosystem is based on the organisms and the ammonium to nitrogen ratio. Nitrate to ammonium ratio. And if you look at this from the perspective of, like, say, working with a farmer, you know, you want for the soil food web to have like a good amount or good ratios and good numbers of organisms to start growing some crops and not just weeds. You need like these minimum numbers. So like 135 micrograms per gram of bacteria. And same with, like, you don't want any of these. We know that actinobacteria like anaerobic conditions. And so once again, if you have lots of these bacteria, they kind of look like fungi. They used to be called actinomycetes, but they're bacteria. And they form these long chains, so they look like they're almost hyphae, but they're very thin, and you can tell, and they've got a specific smell as well. So when you know you have them, once again, your oxygen levels are decreased. So you don't want to see many of them, but fungi you need. See that ratio? Like if you've just got that 1-to-1, you can now start growing good food, you know. Yeah, things will be all right. Things are good when you've got that ratio at least. If you're just growing, like not a forest, but, you know, crops. And protozoa, you need at least 10,000. And nematodes, you want more than 100 per gram. So you can calculate that out and get it. And then this is an interesting, I borrowed this from the Soil Food Web School, but you can see that, you know, initially this is how you do it. You find out what you have initially, and then you make your compost or your worm farm castings or whatever it is where you're cultivating these microbes. And then 2 weeks later, you look at the survivability, and you can see like bacteria have survived quite well, and look how much increase there is. You know, that all those bacteria that were placed in this through 1 ton of compost application did survive in the soil. So that's fantastic. And then even you can do in DNA analysis and find out your species increase, you know, like fungi in this case. That's great. Yeah, it's so good to see like that much fungi survive just in 2 weeks. Like, that's amazing. Like when you've got, but that's probably, you know, you're not spraying anymore, you're not tilling anymore, you're not distracting, you're not, you know, messing up the system, you're allowing it to recover and applying these organisms to feed your soil. So this is the part where we're going to talk about the restoration process, and that's using different like hot compost, static compost, and vermicompost. This is my favorite and preferred method, just because the worms are involved and it's the easiest, and anyone can do it very easily. The other two, the static one is easy. The hot compost is a little bit tricky to make, but basically what is required if you're going to use these, and of course if you have your own garden, you're probably doing this already, like you might not be tilling, like you might not be, moving your soil much, you just might be growing like a no-dig garden. So in a farm system, that's what it would be. And then you're growing biodiversity. We just keep talking about this biodiversity in the soil. We want the same about like monoculture. It will work with monoculture, but wouldn't you want it to be pumping? Like when you remove your crop, something has to feed those organisms still, right? So if you have nothing to grow, so it's best to just grow perennial crops constantly and multi-species, different varieties, and then still harvest and make an income from the harvest of those as well, or feed it, or use it as organic matter, as green mulch, as green manure. So having lots is good, and the variety, and always keeping the ground covered. And then if you have a crop that requires your fungi, you need to then, these fungi die if they have no plant. They're so obligate, they are called obligate symbionts. That means that they just have to be with a plant to survive. So if you remove your crop, you'd have to inoculate your fungi again. You're spending money. You could be just growing another crop that is also shares the same symbiotic fungi, and therefore you always continually supporting. It's like you're farming the soil. I should be saying like you're farming your microbiome in the soil. They are also a livestock in a way. Do you know what I mean? Like you need to keep them supplied with food. And of course, any fertilizer will just kill it because they're all salt-based. They're desiccated. They just kill things And fungi specifically, the symbiotic ones, their role is to provide nitrogen and phosphorus to the plant. That's their main role. So if you give to the plant nitrogen and phosphorus, the plant's like, I don't need to be giving you my sugar. Do you know what I mean? The plant's like, why am I giving you this? Someone's feeding me all this junk food for free. Not to the farmer, it's not for free, but so that symbiosis goes, it just doesn't stay there once you start fertilizing. So there's a period of time when the farmer's going to go through like a crisis, and oftentimes they're already at a crisis when they start turning to this because the land is poisoned, there's just dust ball, and there's no life left in it. So there's just, it's only a matter of time where every single farm that's being inundated with fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides is going to have this issue, so it's just a matter of time because there's only so much you can get out of that then,
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that it's sensible to grow another, say vegetables, another crop after the one you've grown that uses that needs the same fungus or is it bacteria? So how do you know? How do you know what crop to follow? Because I've always...
You have to kind of research it.
Yeah, but where?
I don't know.
Because I've always rotated crop families, like your solanum family, you don't put that in the same bed the next time. But,
that's just to prevent disease build up.
And also, I understood that particular family might take out certain nutrients out of the soil. So if you keep growing another one, like tomatoes after potatoes, then you're going to get those more nutrients extracted. Whereas if you rotate it, they can build up for the next one. But I don't know what to grow, like apart from just rotating the families.
Yeah, and have you had success though? As a result?
Yeah, it's fine.
I think with vegetables it's fine. Like, we're talking about probably because vegetables are sort of like, how weedy is a tomato? I mean, seriously, tomatoes pop up everywhere where there's humans. It's very low request. Same as like brassicas, they really are they don't even want fungi. Literally, they don't like mycorrhizal fungi. They're probably one of the only families that doesn't like it, and they're fine in anaerobic conditions. They sulfur loving, they produce sulfur. They take sulfur out of the ground.
So it's not so important.
It's not so important if you're just growing your
small amounts.
Yeah, I suppose also small amounts, and also I don't know if you've heard of syntropic agriculture, where you're growing a lot of different things all the time, and you're kind of replacing, and that's kind of like mimicking the forest in a way, isn't it? Because things have their time of growth, and then but straight away you've got another plant in there. So that all just works together. So then you don't even have to worry, well, have I got my inoculum in there? Is it stayed alive? Or do I have to worry about nematodes and then, trying to put a different crop through to prevent that from happening? So I think it's more like monoculture, where you're stripping everything, and like your soil will be fine for a while. It will have a little, like you're probably not like taking every little bit out, whereas they spray afterwards to kill all the weeds, you know what I mean? The organic matter is stripped, it's taken out, and it's, either sold somewhere or... So I'm talking about sort of the intense agricultural systems that can change to sort of a gardening situation like you're talking about, where yes, you replace things, but there's this, there's a kind of continuity, whereas sometimes, it was known to, it was recommended that, you leave your land fallow and let it rest. There's nothing more crazy than that, because what are all those organisms going to eat in the soil? That's because we didn't know they were there in the first place until Elaine asked questions. Why are these creatures there I'm seeing? She was studying fungi, and all the experts, she went and they were like, they don't mean anything. She was like, yeah, why would nature put them there? And that's when she discovered the soil food web, that all of those components are necessary, all of those organisms, and they work together. So we just don't know much. So because we don't, we haven't, I think in the past, and if traditionally how people, even in Amazon, how they farm, they would have just gone from parcel to parcel, let it regenerate. It's continuously within the ecosystem. It was never separate. Now we've got these big farms, monoculture, and their locust comes through and they're like, yay, party food, And so I guess that's the kind of what can you do? And then we know it works because you can still harvest. And you can grow many families of plants in as a cover crop constantly and still grow your the plant you're selling, the grain or whatever. As long as the plants are lying low, you can literally constantly have a cover and constantly grow and feed, even when your crop is not present, and keep planting within that crop. And people are doing that, and Elaine recommends that very much. And you want to retain your stubble. The last straw revolution, is that what it's called? That book by the Japanese author who, is it the last straw revolution? Yeah, he experimented with just putting things, and the Japanese like things, really straight. I remember reading in his book, they were trying to mimic what he was doing. He was basically just never harvesting. He'd harvest the grain and leave all the stubble and just let it dump it back on the ground. But when they were doing research on what he was doing, because it was working so well, they put it all in straight lines and made it look all pretty, but it didn't work because the plants couldn't come through the stubble that was laid perfectly, because it needed some sort of, here you've got everything everywhere. It's as if nature dropped it, So that was interesting to learn as well. The more natural systems are, the more they actually produce for us in the end. It's we work so hard, but nature's already got all these creatures doing all the work. I just love it. So the ways we could do this was a compost we created with a farmer. We did a trial with Healthy Land and Water, supported this little grant. So that's a compost pile that we're going to use. And basically we just use these 3 paddocks at the back to do a monoculture of millet versus multi-species cover crop, and then we applied biology from the compost that I tested over time to see whether we could have some survival or how it would affect the plants. And that's just a really quick one because I've talked to you guys for a very long time now. But basically, you have, we had multi-species cover crop, and we just wanted to see whether the microbes survive and demonstrate whether we could improve plant health and soil health or get some maybe yield differences. And because this is a hardy process, I didn't include all the photos in, but this has got a cow manure, we had to, and you have to make it very recipe based, very specific, because what you want to do is you want to heat it so all the pathogens are killed, and you want to have the right ratios of all the foods and diversity of it, so your microbiome ends up giving those results, those numbers I showed you, right? So it's very specific, and you can do it in 21 days, but it requires a lot of work because you've got to know the recipe, you've got to know what works, have you got the nitrogen that will heat up the system to sufficient temperatures, and then you've got to measure the temperature. And over a few days, you kind of measure it, and it's very intense. And then if it gets too hot, you've got to just deconstruct it and put it back together. Sorry?
It sounds like a scrub turkey.
Actually, maybe we could just use the scrap turkey to do it. Why do all this work? Yeah, exactly. And I wouldn't be surprised that there's amazing microbiology in that. You've got to go and find a turkey nest and chuck it under the microscope. But yeah, so basically once the pile is at a right, settles down, you've got those microscopy testing again, and then you get those numbers that I showed you already.
It's a lot of trouble, isn't it?
It is, but it's like a few days, and then you've got a lot. And so if you're a farmer, then you can apply, like on acreage, lots of this compost ready-made, you know. It does work, and you just got to make it and learn how to do it. And once you've got your recipe, you can keep doing it, you know.
But that's not biodynamic farming.
No. This is just knowing, like, it's a very scientific. It's an aerobic thermal compost that you're really like, you know, you're controlling the whole system as much as you can, and you know what you're putting in. So with our one, we did find that we had like a fungal to bacterial biomass in the end at 2.3. So that's pretty good. It's hard to get that 1-to-1, but we went above it. So, and all the other organisms were already like very good in that compost in the end. So I was very happy with the result of the compost. And then what we did was added worm castings that I've tested as well. And we basically made an inoculum for the seed. So we put like a slurry, and these are the different crops we had. So it was like an 8 mixed cover crop. And the soil had like really low organic matter as well. So it was pretty bad. It was just clay, and there's no rain. I'll talk about that in a sec. But anyway, so we just had a mix, and that was just like a recipe we found online that you can, just to make it stick to the seeds. So just like a slurry, and then made the seeds. I didn't even show how we inoculated the seed, but we did. I must have taken that photo out. But basically these seeds got inoculated. We just shoved them in there and then we dried them. And then you have, so we had really bad rainfall that month. And because we're under ground pressure, we had to sow. And we're waiting for the rain, and the rain never came. So the irrigation failed, everything. It was gonna be a flop. Like I was 100% certain it was gonna be a flop. Which is fine because it's a trial, right? And you can't control all these things. And like we wanted to spray the field as well, and the pump failed. There was like something happened, didn't go through, so the inoculum didn't go through. And you spend all this time and heat stroke and all. It was a nightmare for me because it was like my first time doing this, and I was just like, God, we've got to get it perfect. And it was bad. So everything was against us basically. And the plants, you can see the soil, what it looks like. And so basically the millet did die, and the biology we didn't even like, we applied it to half of the, you know, with millet, with biological application and without, or the seed coated and without. And this, but look at this, right? See this line here? See how it's like different? So this one would have had no biology, and this one, these seeds got the biological application. And what happened was, I actually put that in, I didn't have to talk about that much. So there's biology and there's multi-species control. But what has happened, they invited, because we did like a presentation for the community afterwards, but what happened was they invited these guys that can do drone photography, and it's like specific to find out what happens in the field. And like in this case, they tested for chlorophyll content. And when it's that color, that spectrum, you have lots of chlorophyll content, so there's a healthier crop. And it does show a difference, like you can see it, right? And because it's so straight, it must have been, even if we sprayed the paddock later, which we did, but because I don't even know how much that really worked in the end. But I think what's happening is it's showing us that because of the straightness, that would have been a tractor putting a seed in, do you know what I mean? So, I mean, that's pretty, we were like, oh my gosh, like, and we didn't know this guy was gonna come and do this. So this was just like an extra bonus, like. So that was the result. And also when we did the yield measurement, it turned out there was a 35% increase in the wet weight and 20% increase in the dry weight of the treated inoculated crop. And in the end, because it rained, the crops were amazing. They just grew, like they were growing, doing nothing for so long. All of a sudden it rained and everything just came to life. I couldn't believe it. I was in love with the cowpeas. They were beautiful. In fact, here they are. You know, and I'm not saying that they were like amazing because I don't know like you know, but the crop yield was definitely significantly different, and then you've got that multispectral data as well. So something went right in the end. But what we thought as well was, because when I tested the microbiology, I didn't see many increases in all these organisms. But then there's this thing called quorum sensing. Have you heard of this concept? It's when there's enough biodiversity of organisms, and they might be just sitting there dormant or not even be present, but all of a sudden there's a genetic switch when organisms start waking up, and there's a literal, it's like quorum or like many doing something and stimulating all the others. So what we thought would have happened was a lot of the bacteria that would have been either dormant or not present, or things started to just change. It woke up the system. Things started waking up. That's what we thought in the end, because I wasn't seeing, as I said, many. But the other thing, that's also interesting, sorry. So basically, but the idea behind it is diversity of plant families. Christine Jones, has anyone heard of Christine Jones? She's an Australian soil ecologist, and she talks about multi-species cover cropping, and she's really into the mycorrhizal fungi as well. So she helps farmers to recover their land by growing multi-species, but also it's the best when it's different families. You know how you were talking earlier, like not to mix, like make sure that there's but if you've got many different families or different plants, there's like no competition of whatsoever, and they're all doing their job, and they're not competing for resources, they're literally feeding each other. It's like incredible. Biodiversity is the key on everything, you know. So because you then have diverse exudates, so different foods coming through the plant to feed your microbes, and then your nutrient cycling is increased because now you've got all these organisms doing everything together. So all your plants are just thriving and are immune, you know. And so always ensure that also you can reduce your field application of water by 50%. So all the farmers that are doing this in the US, that Elaine's working with, they're all reducing up to 50% moisture. Because when you think about it, all these fungi especially, doing that whole, you know, and the glues and all the glomalins and things like that, just allowing the moisture to stay there. And everything's like a sponge. It becomes like a sponge. That's what soil's meant to be, like a soft, lovely, beautiful sponge. And so moisture initially should be in, obviously from this, we've discovered like we needed the moisture because at the beginning you don't have those organisms. But then you won't need to irrigate as much. And you know, you've got to create your compost and check for microbial diversity and apply extract, or you can also extract it. So if we were to spray more of the biology, which we did eventually on the crops, you can actually make an extract, like take out from your compost just the liquid, like dissolve it almost through a bag that will allow the organisms to pass through, like a sieve bag, you know, like a nut bag or something. Or you can just do it and push air through the bag, and you can do it by hand. We did it by hand because we had a small plot. But basically, you can dislodge those organisms, and as long as there's no filters in your spraying equipment, they will come through and end up on your soil. So there's multiple ways of doing this. But of course, if you've got no organic matter, putting compost down is great because you've got that organic matter that you're adding. And then, you add that to your plants, and then you retain crop residues and mulch to increase soil organic matter and the fungal biomass, and provide perennial ground cover to feed beneficial microbes. So that perennial ground cover is what we started with there, and that's probably the key, to be honest, because no matter which way we look at it, we're talking about all this devastation on Earth at the moment, you know, climate change and all that, but really it's just lack of biodiversity. We're just losing species, and species is what makes this entire thing go, as you can see from soil, you know. Soil's a great example because you can quickly show things in a micro scale, you know what I mean? You can do it in a pot plant even, you know, but if you can see that and understand that concept, then we'll just go, now we just need to plant as many species of plants back. And whether that's in an agricultural system where we eat them, or whether that's increasing the entire biomass on Earth, you know, that's the answer. So we do have the answer, but you minimize and avoid soil disturbance, direct drilling, because when you drive a tractor through it, you're obviously ripping up all the fungi, number one. You know, your fungi will just go, and we just need the fungi back. We need them back. They're just so low, even in rainforests now. Like sometimes when I look at it, I'm like, how is this tree surviving? But I guess they've got their, partner fungi as well. So after the floods, it was terrible what was happening in our soils. I did a few tests of different soils after the rains, and honestly, the floods just make everything anaerobic because it's underwater. It will recover, but it's a hit. It's a hit to the ecosystem. So you want to direct drill your crops, your seeds, and ensure survival of the microbes. You just want to do that, and that you're basically just farming these little guys. And all of that produces, soil moisture retention, structure, drought resistance, carbon sequestration, nutrients available to plants, cycling of those nutrients, and then vigor in human and animal health. And there's studies showing that, when cows are dying, and they, like one of Elaine's examples, where the cows were losing their jaw because they were so nutrient deficient, and they just got this disease that just basically they were breaking their jaws. And anyway, so they applied compost to and they did trials. Like they took one half of the herd, equal disease ratios, and as soon as the compost went on and the plants started growing, the cows recovered. It's amazing. It's not really that amazing because, all these things that I've talked about, the nutrient cycling is so important, but that's what happens. And of course, then the farmer doesn't have to keep, paying for seed to grow their plant. So it is incredible, and it is great that we have this amazing research available to us, and we can play around with it. But also it eliminates weeds and fertilizer and pesticides, and reduces workload for the farmer. So farmers don't really have to do much. They really just have to ensure those microbes are doing the work, and then they can just plant and harvest. And once the biology is applied for long enough to retain those microbes, they will you don't need to do anything. You just do a few inoculations at the beginning because everything's struggling, But once your numbers are up and you're feeding them, it just goes. So this is just to show you what was really exciting about it as well, just quickly. So I looked at the roots as well, because I was like, I'm not seeing anything in the soil, any changes, but all these other things are suggesting there is something happening. It turns out the roots were full of fungi, and I don't know what types of fungi, whether any of them were mycorrhizal, but basically that's the sorghum roots. I thought that might have been an herbacule, possibly, I'm not sure. You have to have special ways of treating the roots to do that, to find out, but all these fungi were growing, and I just thought it was cool. And that's sorghum. And then there's even a fungal feeding nematode around the root, which was pretty cool, and protozoa. And then the cowpea, we didn't inoculate the cowpea. We bought one without inoculant to see what would happen. Mm-hmm. And then we found nodules. Mm-hmm. Just naturally, still the bacteria in the soil are there. They're just waiting for the plant. So I split up a nodule and took, just to see the bacteria.
Yeah, I found active nodules on my legumes too without being inoculated.
Yeah, because there's natural Australian species as well in the soil, So that's pretty cool, yeah. Fungal hyphae, just through the root cells. And so the next one, so that's 3 options, right? You can do a static one, a static pile. And I talked about David Johnson before. So you can do that, set it up. We did it a simpler way because you can see all these things that he's got sticking out, and that's pretty full on because you've got to get it through. And so we did I run a mycology research project at Woodfordia, and this is kind of where it's all led me to this kind of work. And because I felt like, I just want to keep going with this whole concept of increasing soil fungi diversity. So the project has gone to a way where we've done all kinds of things like experiments with scientists looking for different fungi species, because it was like a 3-year project, which actually the funding runs out next month. So we're closing it now, but we created this Johnson swim bioreactor. We just put like a 20 centimeter, I think it's 30 centimeters, it's a foot in the middle to allow moisture. And then we just filled it with, basically just got all the dead vegetation from around us, because we've got a forest. And the whole idea is to improve the soil and resilience of the plants we're planting and the forest that we've grown in Woodfordia to support, because when it's dry, honestly, things just some trees just, even after 20 years, they just don't do well, you know, just because everything's either going flood or drought, you know what I mean, that whole pressure. But you can, you know, sustain for longer if you've got these microbes. So we created this, you can just see the pictures, I won't go too much into it, it's very self-explanatory. We basically filled it up. I bought some of it as well because we couldn't just make enough once a month, and filled it up. And so now I'm just testing it every so often, just to like see how the succession of the microbiology is going in there.
So what's going in that central cylinder?
It's just air.
Ah,
It's just to
right.
allow, like air apparently can travel
Yeah.
1 foot from either direction. So if you have a ring rather than these posts, which is, you know, Sue him and his wife developed this system, and it works really well. It's just a bit more awkward.
So that's not a hot compost, is it?
No. I mean, it can go hot if you add nitrogen to it, like manure, but we didn't. We just did basically just, you know, whatever vegetation we had from around, and woody, because I wanted as much fungi as possible. That was my little plan for it.
So if you put woody stuff in your compost, it creates a bit of fungus, doesn't it?
If you put, so yes. So I'll talk about this now. So
I've been doing things accidentally.
Yeah.
Right.
yeah, definitely. Any woody sort of mulchy stuff is the best. So this is like a project or initiative that I'm sort of starting because I just feel like, how can we do this where we can become involved in what we eat, like in the farming? How can we help farmers without, because farmers won't all want to do a compost or a worm farm. Definitely we can train farmers to do that and set it up and help them set it up. But what about me, like living in, you know, just like I've got all this waste, I've got land, and like there's this amazing, like in a commercial worm farming systems, so the whole idea behind it is that people would actually use their own garden waste and their food waste. So we take like 10% of greenhouse gases that end up in landfill, being generated from landfill, just because we put food in it. If there's no food in landfill, that's 10% gone. Like we're not making methane, you know, just from our own waste. So if we all had this flow through worm farm, and I'll show you what it looks like in a second, and then that could go through someone like me and be tested and then given as an inoculum, like in a large amount of course, just to work with farmers. You know, so people, the community would give these their own microbiome that they're cultivating. Someone tests it, and then it goes out to the farmer and helps that farmer on that plot that is designated towards it to not be sprayed, and just to see what happens. And they can still get yield from it, so there's no cost to them initially. They just like, you know, unless they wanted to do other things or have their whole farm, of course, that would cost. But initially, like for whatever amount we could contribute, you know, it could be done locally. So there could be hubs in every area where if there are local farmers, could be just vegetable growers, market growers. And you just start like this, where we just donate this, right? We've got to make sure it's got all the organisms in there, so you teach the people to do it properly, like so it's a good one farming, not just a sloppy, you know, anaerobic one. And then, and then just train, like just create this potential for it to be a thing, like, so that's why it's called giving soil, because in the way the soil will give, but we're also giving to the soil that we're harvesting from, because we're eating from that. And just to wean every farmer on the planet of pesticides and, you know, just to get rid of what's poisoning the ecosystems, poisoning us, killing all the microbes, and encouraging this whole idea of that maybe not just a monocrop can grow, and all build up on all these ideas, on these plots that farmers might donate, but they're getting stuff, you know, they're not getting compromised, they're just getting given to. And we support that, and we might even have people go out and spray it out for them. We might even come up with technologies like how do we develop sprayers? They usually have equipment, but it's full of, you know, pesticides usually. But they've already got equipment, and that farmers know like they land and how, you know, the machinery they need and stuff. So I think, like, I know it just sounds like a little thing, but I just think if it were, like, if people were willing to do it, if I'd be willing to do it, and that just means talking to farmers, you know, going to someone who's producing something, and then just collaborating with them on just making that just a promise that they wouldn't till and spray, and fertilize that little bit. It could be tiny, it could be just the size of, 1/4 of this room. It doesn't have to be a big thing, just proof of concept, so they don't feel like if I give it all up, I'm just gonna have no income, because that's what these farmers have to go through initially. It's a very hard process for them when they lose, between when the land is dead to before it recovers, there's that period of recovery. But if you can show that period of recovery, and if you can do it plot by plot or something like that, I don't know.
There's a lot of community gardens happening at the moment. You should do them.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I've done one. So that leads me to this next thing. So this is a result of Permaculture and Noosa Cooroy Community Gardens. I gave a talk like this to them, and then basically we went further and we created the workshop for these things. So the vice president, she rang up the council, can you give us some bins? And the council said no because they destroy them. So she's like, okay, well, who is the company that takes the bins? And she found Clean Waste, and they donated 27 bins.
Nice.
We just had to go and pick them up. And yes, they're not brand new, but that's a good thing because they didn't end up in landfill. So that was their whole idea, that we're also taking these big bins, plastic, out of the landfill. And we created these worm farms with, this is the only pretty much this, and the latches and stuff had to be bought. I was trying to scavenge whether I could get these conduit, basically, like an electrical or a plumbing conduit. Sorry? Yeah, exactly. And as long as it's strong enough, and basically what you do is you then put your worm farm on that. You set it up so that you've got 60 centimeters of worms growing and developing, And the reason for this is you harvest from the bottom, so you're not disrupting the fungi, and you're allowing you're not disrupting the worms, but you're allowing the fungi to develop, because it takes a little while. And in a shallow worm farm, there's very little likelihood of having good fungal biomass because there's not enough time, and you're moving it, and if it's shallow and you're harvesting and you're disrupting, so it's all about just getting a rake and raking it from the bottom, and that's where you've got a little door. So the workshop worked. We worked it out. We know what needs to be done. We had 30 people turn up, and everyone took a bin home, and we just workshopped it with the Permaculture Noosa president the day earlier, and I've already made a couple before that. So I learned how to use the tools and stuff, and we just ran it, and people then experimented with their own tools. So we had teams doing different things, people cutting conduit, people cutting screen to cover the...
Where's the access?
Did you
get a little flat door?
Yeah, a little door. Yeah, I'll show you in a second. There'll be there's a little latch, so that was cut out with a jigsaw. And then there were people putting screen on there. That needs to be workshopped a little bit more. I'm thinking of rivets because hot glue didn't work. But yeah, you've got your little access here. So you open your door, and then you pull out your castings, and and you just feed it from the top. And I've made it we recorded it, so I hope I can put up the on YouTube the video of how to feed your worm farm and all the steps. But we could do if you guys know of people that would be interested in the workshop, we could do one. It's just a matter of finding bins or ideally recycling them. And then even if you do nothing else with it but have an amazing worm farm for your own garden or to give it to another gardener, even if that, I think just taking that food out of a landfill, because the worms love the food.
See, I've got some of those I was given, and I cut the bottom out.
Oh yeah?
Those big rubbish bins, and I just threw a whole lot of organic matter in and let it sit. And after a couple of years, it took a long time because they were full, and I just lifted them up and took it all out as compost.
Yeah.
But that's quite different because that's continually extracting from it.
Yes, and
mine weren't worm farms really. They were
just to stay compost.
Organic waste instead.
Yeah, which is still great that you did that. Yeah.
We wanted to increase worms in our garden because we moved up here years ago, nothing would grow. And we put pots in the ground after going to a garden thing and put holes in them, and the worms had just all come out from there. We just keep feeding it.
Wow, with food scraps.
Yeah.
And you know how you mentioned before the whole fungal, the whole. So one thing that I didn't know until I did Elaine's work, course, I used to just feed my, because I've been worm farming for 20 years. I've always had this, I couldn't throw any food away. I've always had this like, no, it goes back in the ground, you know, like that's just how it is. So, but I found that my worm farms, because I only fed them food scraps, they wouldn't have had really good biology in them, you know. And so what you do is you add your organic matter in the form of leaves. When I'm finding like gutter gunk, you know, like I had plants growing out of my gutter, I'm like, maybe I have to clean my gutters. I've never cleaned them ever before. I took them out and it was amazing what grows, the organisms that are in there, and that's just eucalypt leaves, you know. So really like having that component of leaf litter from your backyard, or putting even like organic, I know it's like I buy organic cane mulch, like sugar cane mulch from Bunnings, you know. Because I just, if I don't have anything else, I will go and buy something for it. Because I know that if I add 50% of that on top of my food scraps, like it's great for it. Without it, it's kind of like, yeah, you know, there'll be a lot of like organisms that are not perfect for plants, and then, you know, the whole worm juice thing, that's not even a thing. That's just like a made up concept. It's just like drip from the worm farm. It's not actual juice, or it doesn't really have good.
Doesn't the worm leachate have all of those like bacteria in their gut that they're extracting into the?
No, because see, like, you know, all the glues and stuff that are created holds onto it. So some nutrients will fall, but because it stays there, like there's no oxygen in it anymore. So you start getting ciliates, which are beautiful and cool, but it's not what you really want for your plant. It's kind of anaerobic and it stinks oftentimes, and so it's just that leachate. It's kind of like, that's why in this system, you actually don't, and I'm just showing another example of what you can use if you don't have a bin, but you can literally, like, the idea of it is not to have anything really dripping, you know? Like, it's fine if there's some coming up, but it's good because you need moisture. There's like a few things, like moisture balance is very important. You can go to dry, especially because with an open bottom, there'll be more, you know, likelihood, and that's why the door is good, because it keeps the humidity in there as well. And then you've got your carbon, so you need that woody, almost, that doesn't have to be woody like what are they called, like wood chip, because that's probably a little bit too much for the worms that would take forever to decompose. But something less, you know, something like, I'm even thinking like mulching. I've just bought like a mulcher, you know, like a little silent Ozito one from Bunnings. And I'm gonna try experiment like even like lantana and things, you know, just things that are woody but not so woody, if you know what I mean. Like not like hardwood. But although I think a little bit of shavings from like one of those main sheds wouldn't hurt to put a sprinkle. But diversity, once again, the more you can put in of different things, the better. Minus, you know, what worms don't like, of course, like your citrus and, you know.
So I've been running the mower over a lot of things like sweet potato runners and that, and getting huge buckets full of green stuff. But the way I've been getting rid of that is taking a bed and putting a furrow in it and putting it along the furrow.
Nice one.
With soil.
Beautiful.
And within less than a week, it's gone.
Yeah, that's
just
beautiful.
doing furrows along the
Yeah,
bed.
no, that's great.
So I got rid of a lot of sweet potato that way.
Yeah, oh my gosh, I'd love to have more sweet potato grow.
Yes,
Yeah.
but I have a lot.
Yeah, that's great. So you've got a like really abundant garden, hey? Like
Yeah.
with lots of things.
I've been working on it a long time.
Yeah. So if you had, and it sounds like you already know what you're doing and everything's kind of working, but if you had one of these, what you can do is, you know, get like a bag, like a pool sock. You know those things that are like mesh?
Yes.
They're like a bag that's mesh basically. And you can put some of this stuff that you cultivate and put it in a bag and then just like basically massage it out, just to push air through it so that organisms can dislodge and you put your stuff back in the worm farm.
Well, I've just been using hessian bags and filling them with weeds and suspending them in rubbish bins of water and getting liquid from the weeds.
The only thing about it is it's anaerobic. It goes once again, and you don't have carbon. So yes, you're producing bacterial biomass, but that fungal component is missing.
Yeah, it's just one way. It's
yes,
not the only way.
Yeah, and I suppose in this idea is like, for me personally, and I think for you as well, it's like the fungi thing, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's like, because there's a lot of like, you know, the Korean natural farming, you know, they do like a lot of these preps and things, and they go and get like rice and they put it in the environment and all these organisms land, but you're not really getting those fungal, because once again, rice is not fungal food. So it's just always thinking that way. So I suppose this whole idea is only to really get that fungal biomass going, you know.
I was just trying to get rid of my weeds in there. Get something out of them.
Yeah, totally,
So
yeah.
can I ask, just with this design,
Yeah, put it
because
on
there's
there.
multiple designs obviously of worm farms, is that just to allow easier access?
Yes.
You got holes drainage in the bottom to allow that extra moisture to drain?
Not with these ones, no. They've just got that lip, but I've put mine on an angle, so anything, if there is extra moisture, it just drips out. Or I've put, in one of my other ones, I've put some organic matter on the bottom, like to absorb some, and so it just absorbs and stays. So there's various ways of doing it, and some people have started drilling holes to the bottoms during the workshop just to allow, some moisture escaping. But the idea behind it is not just for access, but also for that fungal biomass to develop, because you've got 60 centimeters, and then you've got some time, because you've got cardboard first on the bottom. So there's some time where nothing happens and you want to wait for that diversity to increase and to mature, because once again, we're looking for that succession over time. So the worms are on the top, and they're probably in the top 20 max. And that, whatever they produce thereafter is going to be what you're going to be harvesting. And it might take a year to get to the top and start harvesting, you know? It takes a while. Depending on how many worms you have, how often you feed, there's all these factors that go into play as well. But the idea would be to get the community, even if we just learn how to really worm farm well, you know, and just get that instilled in kids in schools and everyone doing it. I think in the end, this Giving Soil initiative could, you know, it might take several different directions as to where it goes. Ideally, I would love to work with, you know, producers. And of course, then you've got exactly the same system, but you set it up in a long box, and then the food just drops, or the worm castings drop, and you get like a wench or whatever it's called, like a thing that slices that off, so it falls off. So it's like an automated process. That's what they do commercially. And, you know, they're not very hard to build. You just have to know how to weld. Skill I haven't developed yet. But so there's different ways of doing it. I guess I'm just planting a seed in the community, and maybe just getting people sort of thinking, how can I be part of the solution? Because we're so bogged down with issues and problems at the moment. And I think we can't just leave it to the farmer. We can't just leave it to the government. Do you know what I mean? Even the bins, yes, they might not even, Brisbane City Council destroys theirs as well. But if I call someone, maybe they'll, you know, if it's a person you actually get to speak to, that it's not just an email or whatever, there might be a way of talking to. It might be just imagine
I'll chat to our waste people and find out what we do with ours, and see if we can grab some into a workshop. That would be amazing.
That would be so fantastic.
Kim, can I just ask you, because I'm actually tomorrow having my big landfill bin replaced with a smaller one and getting a bigger recycle bin. So I wonder whether I can ask them if I can keep my original bins.
Mine like that.
And instead of swapping them, if they can just give me my new bins. Would Moreton Bay Waste let us do that?
I don't know.
No.
That's my short answer. I would have to find
I
out.
might ring them today and see if they'll let me keep my original
I
bin.
might try and damage mine.
That's what they're worried about.
Oh,
That's okay, because if it's got a split lid, you can work with that.
the bin stuff, not the base.
I think
I'll
so.
send her a curve.
I think so. That doesn't mean we can't necessarily get them. It just means we need to have a chat to somebody.
Yeah, go through the right channels.
Yes.
Yeah, and
Yes.
and the people who I am thinking of would be 100% on board with this, but it doesn't necessarily mean we can still get the bins. So yes, I have to find out. I think you're right. The contractors
Yeah.
do, not the council, I think. But I'll find out. I think it's a great idea. So,
Yeah, it was so good.
Yeah,
It
so
would be, and
really
people
good
loved
option
it,
to do.
and we learned, like, you know, because I had to learn how to do all the myself, like what tools to use. Like I didn't know half the names, you know, and like it can, and like for example, we discovered that of course rain will go through this as well. So now I'm thinking like, what do we do? And I'm thinking of putting on mine a what do you call it? Like corrugated iron, just to do a little roof. But of course, you can also keep it out of the rain just by having it stored. So it's just workshopping it out. But I think as long as you've got the main, you know, these main things added, and something to close it with, and you can even just go for a wire if you don't want to buy it. Because I was like, oh, if we're going to buy all these latches and stuff, then there's still plastic waste. Like I'm trying to think, you know, how to do it in a way where it's all recyclable. Ideally, I would go to a construction site and ask for conduit. And I was lucky that at work they were pulling a building apart. And so I got quite a few meters of this conduit, the grey conduit. So there is a way of, sorry?
Some dumps would have that.
Yes, exactly. See, like this is, I'm
There's a
thinking
trash and
like,
treasure as well, but
Yeah.
you know, maybe we could reach out to contractors, electricians, find out if they've got offcuts they
it'd be so
want
good.
to get rid of.
And we learned so much, like, you know, they can't be the same length because the bins won't. So now we've got a measurement for, as long as it's within that 30 centimeter thing, like I've already got the measurements for what they have to be cut to. So there's so many ways to do this. This is just like one example. And the farms get, so like if you buy one, it's like $300, you know. But if you make one and then you teach someone else to make one, and then, you know, I just hope it becomes something like, that it's not like a commercial thing in the end. I mean, one day maybe Bunnings wants to sell something like this. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't mind. It's more like, how do we like just teach people to do things on their own?
Just have more
And not-
control.
Yeah, and not buy inoculums. Like, why don't you just make your own inoculum? And there's a way of making mycorrhizal inoculum as well. I didn't include this in this because this presentation has blown out, obviously, and we've been chatting as we go. But there's, you know, different ways of doing it that I, you know, I'll make available because I do have. So you can also build one like that. So people do all kinds of amazing
You
things.
often get short of cut timbers from building sites or that, they throw them in.
Yeah, so there's materials are available. Hey.
Then they throw
Yeah.
buildings for about,
I'm just gonna, if you just wait 1 second. So if you guys want to look at, because I've been putting, and I'm going to put videos up on this as well. If you just Google my name, like Sandra Tuszynska and Coda, it's like a web page. It's just like a, it's called a doc page, but it's basically I've got like how to make a farm and links to it as well. But also I'll be putting up a lot of this stuff, and I'd love it if you wanted to. From the main, like if you want to be on the mailing list as to how this develops, and I'll run more education and stuff, I would love for you guys to, like, it's not going to be one of those spamming things, but whenever I do come up with new stuff or ideas or projects, or like if we have these workshops, I'd be happy for you to be on my mailing list. I haven't developed it yet.
So shall I just contact you with that email at the top?
Yes, yep, loveoursoils@gmail.com, yep. And if you guys are happy with your emails to be shared, you've got access, hey. But if anyone doesn't want to, please let me know. I'm not going to be offended at all, like, because literally my idea is just to share this information and have a community of people that are onto this, so that someone else will tell someone else, and we'll just remove at least waste from it. And I know Brisbane City Council in certain areas are now driving, like allowing people to put their food waste into green waste, and they're making compost. But I still don't really know how good their composting
You've got to be
facilities
careful
are.
with green waste. Like, if you get the composting stuff from the tips, you've got to be mindful that people put chemicals in
Exactly.
Roundup, whatever. So I would never. I had a dog once. I did that, and my dog was sick. Really killed him once. So I would never do that.
Yeah, that's why I sort of think like, yeah, this is probably, you know, like if you're looking after your own worm and you want your worms to survive, there's this level of like responsibility for what, you know. I feel like it's like a lovely, and I imagine if kids at schools did all this, like if we had these farms at schools everywhere, and then the sort of just idea behind it, and show. There's another workshop that I want to run is where I bring my microscope and I show people what's in their worm castings, or, you know, and we'll go through all the different creatures live. and maybe eventually people want to buy their own microscopes, train them how to use it. So I would like to grow like that, but as a community thing rather than I just think it'd be wonderful. There's, it's one way to do something about this mess we're in at the moment.
Yes.
And I think if everyone has a bit to play in, we can all change it. If just one person does it, that's fine. But if we had like multiple people doing it, and it catches on, it becomes, and same with like even, I know this is a sensitive probably topic, but human manure. Like if you put human manure, your own manure through a worm farm, it's incredible. Like it's exactly the same thing that happens, and pathogens are eaten. There's nothing in there, because that's what this is designed to do. So I have several friends that have given me their castings, and I've tested them, and they're amazing. Like
So animal feces, dogs,
because it's been treated.
this is
Yeah.
And we even talk about like, do worms die from horse manure because of the worming tablets? But it takes a little while, but it's not necessarily like, you wouldn't be putting it fresh in there, With dog, the nitrogen, what worries me is the level of nitrogen warming up and killing the worms because of the nitrogen content.
Can you put something in to counteract that?
You could probably so a lot of like commercial worm farmers, they will pre-compost stuff. So like your idea with the, your bin just standing there, and you could probably pre-compost things, and then after a while all these chemicals and things will go,
We will mix it.
Yeah, well maybe that's something to experiment with, you see, that's another whole level of, because otherwise you're bagging it and you're putting it into landfill and that becomes methane. And it's in a bag, plastic bag. Have to experiment with dog poo.
Yeah, some people have a separate dog poo composters.
Yes.
They don't put it through their dog stuff.
Yeah. But even, because if it's your own and you've got your own little farm and you're doing it, you can experiment. Do you know what I mean? And you can experiment like with your own poo and stuff, because I just think like, this is amazing. Everything we poop out that's excess nutrient goes into the lake, like the oceans and stuff. Like, why? It needs to go back into the system.
There is someone down the Gold Coast that's actually sending it to agriculture down here to the sunflower fields.